Cloud computing has not lived up to expectations, and enterprises are paying the price. Remember all the buzzwords you heard over the last few years? Digital transformation, modernization, auto-scaling, the list goes on. Serverless, AI, ML. Cloud computing promised all of these powerful services while being inexpensive. It's cheap. You only pay for the services you use. It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? Nevertheless, enterprises and large companies took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. It was a race. Who could unlock the power of the cloud first? Who could complete their digital transformation and migrate to the cloud first? Who would claim the honor of being cloud-enabled? Imagine all the power, speed, and agility to offer all these new services while lowering operational costs and increasing the bottom line. Money poured in to make this a reality. Now it feels like money's leaking out. What happened? What went wrong? Several things went wrong. Before we dig into that, let me provide some context. Saying that cloud computing hasn't lived up to expectations, well, that's a bold statement and one that will surely ruffle some feathers. So when I say that cloud computing hasn't lived up to expectations, you have to ask, what were the expectations? I've been involved with more than one digital transformation or cloud migration. I sat in on many of the cloud presentations where the audience were filled with technical and non-technical people alike. Everyone was wooed when they saw the power of the cloud. All the technical people saw the power and flexibility, while the non-technical people saw the ease of use and the reduction in operating costs. So to give you a real-world example, imagine that you sold toys online. Of course, during the holidays, your sales would spike, and then afterward, those numbers would come back down to normal. But you have to plan for those spikes. You wouldn't want your site to crash during the biggest days, right? So if you needed 10 servers on a normal day, but 100 servers on your peak day, well, guess what? You needed to have 100 servers and pay for them all year around. Cloud computing offered services such as auto-scaling. So the tech guys were like, wow, we can set this up so servers will automatically scale up and down as necessary. So we no longer have to worry about capacity constraints. That makes administration super easy. Meanwhile, the business people were like, that means we only have to pay for 10 servers per day instead of 100. And when we need the extra capacity, we can pay for it. That sounds like a win-win. Everyone's happy. Let's do it. So while all of that is true, something was lost in translation. It seems like people only heard what they wanted to hear. People came out of those meetings believing that you could simply cut and paste your servers into the cloud and boom, suddenly you had all of the power of cloud computing. The cloud is a lot of things, but it isn't magic. The cloud was an entirely new system. In order to leverage the power of the cloud, your applications must leverage that new system. So in layman's terms, if your application could only handle a few users at a time, simply moving it to the cloud doesn't suddenly make it capable of handling mega users. Again, it's not magic. And this is a very simple scenario. I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but for this to actually work, you must ensure that your application can first handle multiple users. You have to set up load balancers, targets, auto-scaling groups. You have to set up all these cloud-specific things. You can't just drag and drop expecting everything to work. But unfortunately, that's exactly what people thought. And that's the message that was presented to executives. Don't forget that everything's easy on paper. I'm pretty sure those presentations went something like this. We're paying all this money for our data centers and our equipment, but if we move that to the cloud, we won't have to pay for that stuff. Never mind all the resources like network engineers and software engineers, since everything will be in the cloud with the cloud provider. It'll be like any other vendor. We'll have SLAs in place, and if something goes wrong, we can just call them. And as an added bonus, the cloud gives us all these additional capabilities that we don't have today. We can scale our capacity on demand, we only pay for what we use, and we'll have things like machine learning and AI. And that executive sitting there thinking, okay, so we get increased capabilities while lowering overall costs, no more data center costs, resource or equipment costs. So naturally he asks, how much will it cost to get us there? And how much will we save once we get there? For example, let's say it'll cost us $10 million over the course of 3 years. Then we'll save $10 million per year after that. Sounds like a pretty good deal, right? As you can imagine, the deal gets signed, the CEO sends out a press release, investors like the news, the stock price goes up, yay! Then 3 years later, project's done, but wait, why aren't we seeing any savings? Investors start asking, where's all the savings? Where's the artificial intelligence? That's a bad spot for the CEO to be in. And you know the saying, it all rolls downhill. So what went wrong? Normally, with cloud migration projects, you can follow two main patterns. You can slowly but surely migrate applications one by one to the cloud, or you can use another approach, which is to lift and shift everything to the cloud. Then afterwards, or during a phase 2, replatform everything to use cloud-native technologies. Meanwhile, soaking up all those savings from not paying for the data centers anymore. And remember that I said everything looks easy on paper. That has never been more evident. We brought in vendors to move our servers to the cloud. We'll have X number of servers moved by this date and then more on that date. We'll have all these milestones documented. On paper, everything was set. But nowhere on that plan was there a mention of replatforming to cloud-native technologies. That sort of got lost in translation. Oh, and there's this part. Leveraging cloud-native services can be cheap, but not leveraging cloud-native services can be expensive. Very expensive. And those old school non-cloud standards don't exactly work in the cloud. Forcing old standards into the cloud is like forcing a square peg into a round hole. And even if you're successful, it won't be cheap. Everything is different in the cloud. You can't expect to hire some outside teams to come in, lift and shift everything to the cloud, then walk away and say, okay, project's done, you're on your own. Meanwhile, your IT staff is doing the best they can with what they know. But they know how to work within data centers, not the cloud. So their standards will be based on data center methodologies, not cloud methodologies. Guess what that means? 3 years later, after the cloud migration, executives are asking, why are we paying more now in the cloud than we've ever paid before? And this is very real. There's a level of shock and awe when the cloud expense doubles month over month. It's not often that your CIO or CEO pulls all of IT together to say, stop what you're doing. We need to reduce cloud spend now. This is happening across the board. As fast as enterprises ran to the cloud, well, they're running from it now. You don't know what you don't know. And in this case, no one expected cloud costs to be as much as they were. I mean, weren't we supposed to be saving money? I don't want to paint the picture that cloud providers were at fault here. There were several factors at play. I was in many of those meetings. Those cloud providers never lied to us. Maybe they embellished or exaggerated, but there were no lies. In order to take advantage of what the cloud has to offer, you have to set things up for the cloud. I mean, picture it like this. You can take a ping pong paddle to a tennis court, and while you can hit the ball, you wouldn't want to play tennis that way. And unfortunately, that was the approach taken by many enterprises. But it's hard to place blame. Everyone made decisions based on the information they had. I think people underestimated how difficult it is to make the transition from an on-prem data center footprint to the cloud. If you were a cloud engineer, then sure, no problem. But if you weren't already a cloud engineer, how were you supposed to know what you didn't know? People took for granted the leap in expertise. If you've never worked in the cloud, it's going to take you some time to ramp up. And it goes the other way too. I've interviewed recent graduates that have only ever worked in the cloud, and they're lost when it comes to old school data center methodologies. Leveling up an entire IT staff from an on-prem mentality to a cloud-first mentality takes a significant amount of time. Remember that slow and steady approach that I mentioned earlier? That's the best way to handle this type of cloud migration. That gives people time to learn the technology. But it isn't pretty. There's almost no return on investment for several years. So when faced with the alternative, everything looks easy on paper. Why would anyone choose the slow route? As a result, enterprises are moving back to data centers for a more hybrid approach. Maybe some of those applications don't need to be in the cloud. Maybe instead of having 10 data centers, you just have one data center that houses mission-critical applications or applications that don't work well in the cloud. At the end of the day, executives need to take a pragmatic approach. Sure, some got burned on this one, but they're working hard to right those wrongs. Ultimately, the cloud is here to stay. This pullback to data centers will likely be temporary. This move gives engineers more time to ramp up and learn the new methodologies. And don't forget, the new crop of engineers will likely only have cloud experience. So while this is a temporary retreat, the next cloud push will take full advantage of the cloud and its cost optimization. Enterprises will be where executives expected them to be the first time around. Keep in mind that this is just from an enterprise perspective. Cloud computing has completely changed the industry. The power of supercomputing is now in the hands of everyday people. And if I were starting today, these are the technologies that I would learn.